Let me tell you something that's going to make every WWE executive absolutely furious. The bloodline story that made WWE billions of dollars is falling apart faster than a house of cards, and it's not because of creative genius. It's because of backstage politics, ego clashes, and decisions that are so monumentally stupid that they're about to destroy the greatest faction WWE has created in over 2 decades. And before you keyboard warriors start typing clickbait in the comments, stick around because I've got receipts, insider information, and analysis that's going to change how you see everything happening with Roman Reigns, Solo Sikoa, and the entire Samoan dynasty. This isn't just wrestling entertainment. This is a multi-million-dollar empire imploding in real time, and WWE is scrambling to control the narrative. The foundation cracks. How Roman's reign created its own downfall. Let's start with the uncomfortable truth that WWE doesn't want to acknowledge. Roman Reigns' 4-year championship reign, while financially successful, created a creative poison that's now contaminating everything it touches. When you build an entire company around one man for that long, you don't just create a superstar, you create a dependency that becomes impossible to break without catastrophic consequences. Think about this logically. For 1,316 days, Roman Reigns was positioned as the ultimate final boss of WWE. Every storyline, every feud, every major decision revolved around maintaining his dominance. But here's where WWE made their fatal mistake. They forgot that even the greatest empires in history eventually fall, and when they do, the collapse is always more dramatic than the rise. The Bloodline wasn't just a wrestling faction, it was WWE's insurance policy. Paul Heyman provided the voice, the Usos brought the charisma and tag team excellence, and Roman was the unbeatable final boss. It was perfect, until it wasn't. But here's what really happened behind the scenes, and this is where it gets interesting. Sources close to the situation have revealed that Roman Reigns himself began pushing for creative control over the Bloodline story as early as 2022. This wasn't just about his character. Roman wanted approval power over every member of his faction, every storyline decision, and every major creative direction. Now, before you dismiss this as another Roman is difficult to work with story, understand that this kind of creative control isn't unusual for top stars. John Cena had it, Triple H certainly had it, and The Rock wielded it masterfully. But Roman's approach was different, and according to multiple backstage sources, it created tension that's still reverberating through WWE today. The first major crack appeared during the 2023 WrestleMania season when Roman allegedly vetoed several potential challengers, including a proposed program with Drew McIntyre that would have seen the Scottish Warrior finally get his moment. Instead, Roman pushed for the Cody Rhodes story to continue, believing it would generate more long-term revenue. He was right about the money, but he didn't anticipate the creative corner it would paint them into. Solo Sikoa. The enforcer who became the revolution. This is where Solo Sikoa enters the picture, and if you think his current tribal chief storyline is just creative fiction, you're missing the real story entirely. Solo's positioning as the new head of the Bloodline wasn't just a storyline decision, it was WWE's attempt to solve a very real backstage problem. Here's what actually happened. When Roman began his hiatus after WrestleMania 40, WWE faced an immediate crisis. The Bloodline was their most valuable intellectual property outside of individual superstars, but it was entirely dependent on Roman's presence. They needed someone who could maintain the faction's credibility while Roman was away, but more importantly, they needed someone who wouldn't be completely overshadowed when Roman returned. Solo Sikoa wasn't just the obvious choice, he was the only choice that made financial sense. But here's where it gets complicated. Solo reportedly pushed hard for creative input into his new role, specifically requesting that his tribal chief persona be more than just a placeholder for Roman's return. According to sources within WWE's creative team, Solo presented a detailed pitch for how the Bloodline could evolve during Roman's absence. This wasn't just about maintaining status quo, Solo wanted to establish his own legacy within the faction's mythology. And here's the kicker. WWE loved the idea so much that they began developing long-term storylines that didn't necessarily require Roman's immediate return. This created an unprecedented situation. For the first time in WWE's modern era, they had developed a faction storyline that could potentially continue with or without its original leader. It was brilliant business, but it also set up the inevitable conflict we're seeing now. The Paul Heyman factor. The Wiseman's impossible choice. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, Paul Heyman's role in this entire situation. If you think Paul is just playing a character torn between two tribal chiefs, you're only seeing the surface of what's actually happening. Paul Heyman isn't just the greatest manager in wrestling history, he's also one of the smartest political operators WWE has ever employed. His positioning in the Bloodline story isn't just about character development, it's about protecting his own creative legacy while navigating one of the most complex backstage situations in recent memory. Here's what most fans don't understand. Paul Heyman was instrumental in developing the bloodline concept from the very beginning. This wasn't just Roman's vision or WWE's creative team's idea. Paul was the architect who helped build the entire mythology. His famous, "Acknowledge him," catchphrase. That came from Paul's understanding of how to build mystique around a character who was struggling to connect with certain segments of the audience. But Paul also saw something in Solo Sikoa that others might have missed. According to multiple backstage sources, Paul was one of the strongest advocates for Solo's elevation within the bloodline hierarchy. He reportedly told WWE executives that Solo had that thing, the intangible quality that separates good wrestlers from generational talents. This creates an fascinating dynamic. Paul Heyman essentially helped create two potential leaders for the same faction, knowing that eventually they would come into conflict. Some might call this poor planning, but if you understand Paul's psychology, this was probably intentional. Paul Heyman thrives in complex creative situations where he can showcase his ability to navigate multiple storylines simultaneously. The current, torn between two chiefs, storyline isn't just character work, it's Paul's way of maintaining his value to WWE regardless of how the Roman vs. Solo situation ultimately resolves. If Roman emerges victorious, Paul was the loyal advisor who eventually returned to his tribal chief. If Solo establishes himself as the new leader, Paul was the wise counselor who recognized changing times and adapted accordingly. But here's where it gets really interesting. Sources suggest that Paul has been quietly developing contingency plans for multiple possible outcomes. This isn't just about the immediate storyline. Paul is thinking 3, 4, even 5 years ahead about how the bloodline story can continue to generate revenue for WWE. The Usos. Caught between blood and business. Jimmy and Jey Uso's position in this entire situation is perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the whole story, and it reveals something important about how modern WWE operates behind the scenes. The Usos aren't just Roman's cousins in storyline, they're literally family, and that creates complexities that go far beyond what we see on television. When the bloodline story began, the Usos were positioned as Roman's loyal soldiers, the enforcers who would do anything to protect their tribal chief. But as the story evolved, something unexpected happened. The Usos became the most popular members of the faction. This wasn't supposed to happen according to WWE's original plans. Roman was meant to be the unquestioned star, with everyone else in supporting roles. But the Usos' natural charisma, their incredible tag team work, and their ability to connect with audiences in ways that felt authentic made them fan favorites in their own right. This created a problem that WWE is still dealing with. How do you maintain the hierarchy of a faction when the supposed supporting players are getting bigger reactions than the leader? And more importantly, how do you navigate that situation when real family relationships are involved? According to backstage sources, the Usos' split from Roman wasn't entirely planned from the beginning. WWE had originally envisioned the bloodline staying together much longer, but the organic crowd reactions and the Usos' own creative input led to an earlier dissolution than anticipated. But here's where it gets complicated. The Usos' individual success outside of the bloodline has created what some backstage refer to as a precedent problem. If Jimmy and Jey can succeed without Roman, what does that say about Solo's chances? And more importantly, what does it suggest about the entire power structure that WWE spent 4 years building around Roman's character? Jey Uso's main event push in particular has been a source of both pride and concern within WWE. On one hand, it proves that the bloodline story created multiple stars, not just one. On the other hand, it demonstrates that Roman's dominance might not have been as essential as WWE believed. This has reportedly led to some tension behind the scenes, not between the family members themselves, but between different creative factions within WWE about how to handle the situation. Some executives want to emphasize the Usos' independence to show that WWE can create stars beyond Roman. Others worry that diminishing Roman's importance could damage their long-term investment in his character. The Rock's shadow. How Hollywood changed everything. Now we need to address the massive elephant that's been lurking in the background of this entire story. Dwayne The Rock Johnson's influence on the bloodline narrative, and how his Hollywood success has inadvertently created problems for everyone involved. The Rock's return to WWE programming wasn't just about nostalgia or part-time appearances. According to multiple industry sources, The Rock's involvement was specifically designed to add legitimacy and mainstream attention to the bloodline story. WWE executives believed that The Rock's presence would elevate the entire faction and create crossover appeal that could attract non-wrestling audiences. This strategy worked brilliantly from a business perspective. The Rock's appearances generated massive media coverage, social media engagement, and mainstream attention that WWE hadn't seen in years. But it also created an unintended consequence. It established a hierarchy within the Samoan wrestling dynasty that placed The Rock at the top, above even Roman Reigns. Think about this from Roman's perspective. For 4 years, he was positioned as the head of the table, the tribal chief, the undisputed leader of his family's wrestling legacy. Then The Rock returns, and suddenly Roman is positioned as the heir apparent rather than the current king. This isn't just about storyline positioning, it's about real-world perception and Roman's long-term legacy. According to sources close to the situation, Roman was initially enthusiastic about The Rock's involvement, believing it would add prestige to his character and the bloodline story. But as The Rock's appearances continued, Roman reportedly began to feel that his own accomplishments were being overshadowed by his cousin's Hollywood fame. This created a delicate situation for WWE's creative team. They needed The Rock's mainstream appeal, but they also couldn't afford to damage Roman's character after investing so heavily in his development. The solution they developed, having The Rock ultimately put Roman over while establishing himself as the final boss of the Samoan dynasty, seemed perfect on paper. But here's what they didn't anticipate. Solo Sikoa's rise during this period created a third option that nobody had planned for. While WWE was focused on managing the Roman-Rock dynamic, Solo was quietly establishing himself as a legitimate threat to both of them. By the time WWE realized what was happening, Solo had already gained enough momentum that backing down would have damaged his character irreparably. This led to the current situation where WWE essentially has 3 different tribal chiefs. The Rock is the legendary patriarch, Roman is the established king, and Solo is the rising challenger. It's a creative goldmine, but it's also a logistical nightmare that requires careful management to avoid damaging any of the characters involved. The creative control battle. Why WWE is walking a tightrope. Here's where we get into the really controversial stuff that WWE definitely doesn't want discussed publicly. The ongoing battle for creative control over the bloodline story, and how it's revealing fundamental problems with how WWE manages its top talent. Creative control in professional wrestling isn't just about what happens in the ring. It's about merchandise, appearances, storyline direction, and ultimately, long-term career trajectory. When wrestlers reach a certain level of success, they naturally want more input into how their characters are developed and presented. Roman Reigns, after 4 years as the top guy, understandably wanted significant creative control over his character and associated storylines. This isn't unusual or unreasonable, it's exactly what you'd expect from someone who had carried the company for that long. But Solo Sikoa's rapid rise created a unique situation. Suddenly there were 2 wrestlers who had legitimate claims to creative input over the same storyline. Roman had seniority and track record, but Solo had momentum and was actively carrying the story during Roman's absence. According to multiple backstage sources, this led to a series of meetings between WWE's creative team, Roman, Solo, and their respective representatives to determine how creative decisions would be made going forward. These weren't just casual conversations, these were formal business discussions about how one of WWE's most valuable intellectual properties would be managed. The solution WWE developed was reportedly a compromise that satisfied nobody completely but prevented any major blowups. Creative decisions about the bloodline story would be made collaboratively, with input from all major stakeholders, but final approval would remain with WWE's creative team. This sounds reasonable in theory, but in practice it's created a situation where every major storyline decision requires multiple layers of approval and negotiation. According to sources within WWE's creative team, what used to be simple storyline decisions now require extensive consultation and compromise. This has reportedly led to some frustration among WWE's writers, who feel that the collaborative approach has slowed down the creative process and made it more difficult to develop organic storylines. Some have reportedly expressed concerns that too much input from performers can result in storylines that serve individual interests rather than overall entertainment value. The money factor. How financial pressure is driving creative decisions. Let's be brutally honest about something that WWE would prefer to keep quiet. The bloodline story isn't just about creative excellence or fan satisfaction. It's about money. Massive amounts of money, and the financial pressure to maintain revenue streams is influencing every major decision about how this story develops. The bloodline era of Roman's championship reign was the most financially successful period in WWE's modern history. Merchandise sales, streaming numbers, pay-per-view buys, and international market penetration all reached record levels during Roman's dominance. This success created enormous pressure to maintain those revenue streams even as the story evolved. But here's the problem. Financial success based on one character's dominance creates a dependency that becomes increasingly difficult to manage. WWE found themselves in a situation where their entire business model was built around Roman Reigns' character, making any significant changes potentially catastrophic from a revenue perspective. When Roman began his hiatus, WWE faced an immediate crisis. How do you maintain the financial benefits of the Bloodline story without its central character? Their solution, elevating Solo Sikoa while keeping Roman's return as an eventual possibility, was brilliant from a business perspective, but it created the current creative complications. According to industry analysts, the Bloodline story has generated an estimated $200 to $300 million in direct revenue for WWE through merchandise, streaming, and international licensing deals. This doesn't include the indirect benefits like increased subscriber retention, social media engagement, and mainstream media coverage. These numbers explain why WWE has been so careful about how they've handled the Roman vs. Solo storyline. They can't afford to damage either character, because both represent significant ongoing revenue streams. Roman's return needs to feel triumphant and important, but Solo's elevation can't be reversed without losing the momentum they've built during Roman's absence. This financial pressure has reportedly influenced creative decisions in ways that weren't typical during previous eras. According to sources within WWE's creative team, storyline decisions are now regularly evaluated not just for entertainment value, but for their potential impact on merchandise sales, streaming numbers, and international market performance. The international factor. How global markets change the game. Here's something that most American fans don't fully appreciate. The Bloodline story's success isn't just domestic. It's become WWE's most successful international storyline in over a decade, and that global success has created pressures and opportunities that are influencing how the story develops. Roman Reigns' championship reign coincided with WWE's aggressive expansion into international markets, particularly in the Middle East, India, and parts of Europe where wrestling hadn't previously been popular. The Bloodline story, with its emphasis on family, respect, and cultural heritage, resonated with international audiences in ways that previous WWE storylines hadn't. This international success created a new set of considerations for how WWE approaches the Bloodline story. Decisions that might make sense for American audiences could potentially alienate international markets where different cultural values and storytelling preferences exist. For example, the concept of family loyalty and respect for elders, central themes in the Bloodline story, carries different weight in different cultures. In some international markets, Roman's position as tribal chief is seen as almost sacred, making Solo's challenge potentially problematic. In other markets, Solo's rise is viewed as natural progression and leadership development. WWE's international business team has reportedly provided input into creative decisions about the Bloodline story, ensuring that major developments don't inadvertently damage the story's appeal in key international markets. This isn't creative interference, it's business reality in an increasingly global entertainment environment. But this international consideration has also created opportunities. The current Roman vs. Solo storyline has been particularly successful in markets where family succession stories are culturally resonant. WWE has been able to leverage this success to expand their presence in these markets, creating a positive feedback loop where international success justifies continued investment in the storyline. The next generation problem. Building for the future. Now we need to address something that WWE is quietly but urgently working on behind the scenes. What happens to the Bloodline story when the current generation of performers moves on? This isn't just about Roman, Solo, or even The Rock. It's about ensuring that the Bloodline concept can continue to generate revenue for WWE for decades to come. The Anoa'i family wrestling dynasty includes multiple generations of performers, but not all of them are currently positioned to carry the Bloodline story forward. WWE's long-term planning involves identifying and developing the next generation of Samoan wrestlers who can eventually inherit the storyline. This succession planning isn't just about talent development, it's about intellectual property management. The Bloodline story has become too valuable for WWE to allow it to simply end with the current generation. They need to ensure that the concept can evolve and continue regardless of who's currently carrying it. According to sources within WWE's talent development system, there are currently several young Samoan wrestlers being evaluated for their potential to eventually join the Bloodline story. This evaluation process includes not just wrestling ability, but also charisma, family connections, and long-term marketability. But here's where it gets complicated. The success of the current Bloodline story has set an incredibly high bar for future iterations. Any wrestlers brought into the storyline will inevitably be compared to Roman, The Rock, and the Usos. This creates enormous pressure to find performers who can match that level of success. This succession planning has reportedly influenced current storyline decisions in subtle ways. WWE is conscious that whatever they do with the Roman vs. Solo story needs to leave room for future generations to build upon. They can't create a conclusion that's so definitive that it prevents future storyline development. The women's division opportunity, an untapped goldmine. Here's something that WWE has been quietly developing but hasn't fully capitalized on yet: the potential for women's performers to become part of the Bloodline story in meaningful ways. This isn't just about adding female characters for diversity, it's about recognizing that the Anoa'i family includes incredibly talented women wrestlers who could expand the storyline's appeal and revenue potential. The most obvious example is Nia Jax, who has legitimate family connections and has already been loosely associated with the Bloodline story. But WWE's long-term planning reportedly includes developing storylines that could integrate women's performers more fully into the Bloodline mythology. This represents a massive untapped opportunity. Women's wrestling has experienced unprecedented growth during the Bloodline era, and integrating female performers into WWE's most successful storyline could create crossover appeal that reaches new audiences. According to sources within WWE's creative team, there have been ongoing discussions about how to develop women's storylines that complement rather than compete with the men's Bloodline story. This is delicate creative territory. The integration needs to feel natural and important rather than forced or token. The potential for women's storylines also creates interesting possibilities for merchandise, streaming content, and international market expansion. Female performers often have different appeal in different international markets, and incorporating them into the Bloodline story could open up new revenue streams that haven't been fully explored. The technology factor. How modern media changed everything. Let's talk about something that's fundamentally changed how the Bloodline story is developed and presented: the role of social media, streaming platforms, and modern technology in creating and maintaining wrestling storylines. The Bloodline story has been the first major WWE storyline to fully leverage modern digital platforms. Roman's championship reign coincided with WWE's transition to streaming-first content delivery, and the Bloodline story was specifically designed to work across multiple platforms and media formats. This technological integration isn't just about promotion, it's about storytelling. The Bloodline story includes elements that are developed specifically for social media, streaming exclusive content, and digital-first audiences. This creates a more immersive experience for fans, but it also requires more complex creative planning. According to sources within WWE's digital media team, the Bloodline story generates more online engagement than any other WWE storyline in history. This includes not just official WWE content, but fan-created content, analysis videos, and social media discussions that extend the story beyond what appears on television. This digital success has created new opportunities and challenges. On one hand, it proves that the Bloodline story has cultural impact beyond traditional wrestling audiences. On the other hand, it creates pressure to maintain that level of online engagement, which requires constant content creation and storyline development. The technology factor also influences how WWE approaches creative decisions. Storylines that work well on television might not translate effectively to digital platforms, and vice versa. WWE's creative team now has to consider how every major storyline development will play across multiple media formats. The competition response. How other promotions are adapting. Here's something WWE probably doesn't want discussed: how successful the Bloodline story has been for WWE has forced other wrestling promotions to completely rethink their approach to faction-based storytelling and long-term character development. AEW, in particular, has attempted to develop several storylines that mirror the Bloodline's emphasis on family connections, cultural heritage, and multi-generational storytelling. While none have achieved the same level of success, the attempts demonstrate how influential the Bloodline concept has become across the wrestling industry. This competitive pressure has actually benefited WWE by forcing them to continuously innovate and improve the Bloodline story. They can't afford to become complacent, because other promotions are actively trying to replicate their success. But the competitive factor also creates challenges. WWE needs to maintain the Bloodline story's uniqueness while other promotions develop similar concepts. This requires constant creative evolution and innovation, which puts additional pressure on an already complex storyline. According to industry analysts, the Bloodline story's success has fundamentally changed how wrestling promotions approach long-term storytelling. The critical decision point. Why the next few months matter. We're currently at a critical decision point for the Bloodline story, and the choices made in the next few months will determine not just how this storyline concludes, but what it means for WWE's future approach to long-term storytelling. WWE has to balance multiple competing interests: maintaining Roman's credibility and legacy, establishing Solo as a legitimate main event performer, preserving the Bloodline concept for future development, and satisfying audience expectations for a satisfying conclusion to this chapter of the story. The decisions made now will also influence how WWE approaches similar storylines in the future. If the Bloodline story concludes successfully, it will provide a template for future culturally specific, long-term storylines. If it concludes unsatisfyingly, it might discourage WWE from taking similar creative risks in the future. The ultimate question. What success really means. As we conclude this analysis, we need to address the ultimate question. What does success mean for the Bloodline story? Is it financial performance, critical acclaim, cultural impact, or something else entirely? From WWE's perspective, success is likely measured primarily in financial terms: revenue generation, audience engagement, and long-term value creation. By these measures, the Bloodline story has been extraordinarily successful. From the performers' perspectives, success might be measured differently. Roman Reigns might measure success by his legacy and long-term career trajectory. Solo Sikoa might measure success by his establishment as a main event performer. The other performers involved might have their own definitions of success. From the audience's perspective, success is likely measured by entertainment value, emotional investment, and satisfaction with how storylines develop and conclude. The challenge for WWE is balancing these different definitions of success while maintaining the story's quality and cultural impact. The lasting legacy. What this era really means. Regardless of how the current Bloodline storyline concludes, this era has already established a lasting legacy that will influence professional wrestling for years to come. The Bloodline story has proven that audiences will embrace long-term, culturally authentic storylines if they're developed with genuine commitment and respect. This has opened doors for more diverse storytelling and representation in professional wrestling. The story has also demonstrated the potential for wrestling storylines to achieve genuine cultural impact beyond the wrestling audience. This cultural crossover appeal represents a new model for how wrestling can engage with broader society and cultural discussions. Perhaps most importantly,